Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Adam, and you are in the 75th trip down the Homeward Path. This is my show that I record at the end of the work week. We just came off of hour 55. I'm a husband, father of three, and somehow, some way, we try our best to make some form of competitive Magic work. Right now, like most of you, that method for me is on Magic Arena. But that's not what we're talking about this week. So while I was away, we got the rest of the spoilers for Core 21. We got quite a few of the spoilers for Jumpstart. I don't really want to dive too deep into it, but there's a lot of archetypical stuff getting a lot of support. And there is a lot, there must be a building on fire here in town somewhere, because I've passed like 4 cop cars and here comes a fire truck. So, that out of the way. Standard's already kind of ramp heavy, and then we've got cards like Azusa, Joining, Growth Spiral, Uro, just a number of things at the disposal, a number of pieces in the toolkit, as it were, for these ramp heavy decks. And I would not be shocked to see, a 32 land deck emerge from the other side of the standard format. There's just too much incentive to powering out these powerful cards that it's just mind-boggling. But in addition to that, we got some more cheap innovation. There's some more cheap interaction. Much needed reprints in both sets. There's just a lot to like about what's going on. There's also a lot to dislike, but that's a story for another episode. So with that in mind, we're going to merge fast lane and slow lane into one segment this week, because I want to talk about a deck that I am working on through the lens of my research process in building it. And that deck is Gro. It's the archetype that I've loved the most throughout my time playing Magic. It's the archetype that I never get right, but I love to play it. It's why I played so much Izzet Drake last year. It's why I played various forms of Terramander decks this year. It's why I've played just a litany of bad decks over the years. I love playing decks where I start small and then bludgeon you with a blunt instrument while cutting off the axis of interaction you're trying to play on. It's my kink, I think. But with that being said, the number of times that I've done this in the past without considering the history, without putting in the effort of improving my ability to build decks in order to do it, instead just trying to fill role player slots out of, pre-existing lists, and not really diving deep into the why, but just the what. So let me paint you a picture, and it begins in, God, I can't remember what year, like 2003, 2004, maybe? Probably, 2001, 2002. Probably more an accurate year. But the format at the time was extended. And the deck builder, well, I guess it goes back further than that. And I can't remember the year. But for the longest time, and even today, conventional wisdom tells players of Magic, start your land counts at 24. You can go up, you can go down, but you start with 24 and then you adjust accordingly. Well, how do we get to those other numbers? Well, obviously if you're playing a bunch of ramp effects that are going to pull lands out of your deck or require you to have them in your hands, you're going to want more. But how do we arrive at less other than just having a lower mana curve? Because even still, sometimes your lower mana curve decks can stall out trying to find a desperately needed third land, and you end up having to play like the mono red Hazaret deck that only played 4 to 5 cards that cost more than 3 mana and would frequently find themselves stranded with 1 or 2 of them in their hand until they started adding more lands, and that ended up being like a 25 land deck. And that's kind of emblematic of the issue of trying to balance mana versus spells. Typically speaking, having more lands is better than having more spells, because even though the lands are dead draws later in the game, you'd much rather be able to cast the spells earlier in the game. And they always say flood beats screw, because if you flood out, you can cast whatever you draw. Or if you're mana screwed, you're pigeonholed into needing to draw exactly lands and cheap spells. Excuse me. On my way after getting home, I'm going to clean up, and I've got a doctor's appointment to find out why I keep losing my voice. But that's something we'll get to on a different day. But even today, you build a deck on Arena, and the auto land tool adds 24 lands to your deck. And Alan Comer was one of the first to dare to dream to go lower. Instead of trying to push his land counts up to make sure he hit land drops, he was trying to find out how low he could go. And that resulted in Turbo Xerox, a deck named exclusively for how quickly identical copies of it sprung up all over the west coast of the U.S. It was a mono blue deck that played 17 lands, but almost never was never behind. Like it would just hit its land drops, it would keep casting spells, it would catch up, it would start to pull ahead later in the game, and then it would win, and you'd be sitting here looking at this pile of weird blue cards and wondering what in the world just happened to you. Well, there are 3 major tenets of Turbo Xerox that still apply to deck building today. The first is cantrips as mana fixing. Cantrips being, in this case, cards that cost 1 or 2 mana, see multiple cards, and replace themselves. In Comer's deck, he had access to Brainstorm, Portent, and Foreshadow, I believe. And the way the math worked out for Comer's deck is for every 2 of those cantrips you played, or for every 4 of those cantrips you played, you could cut 2 lands. Or, to put it in lay terms, for every 2 cantrips you play, you can conceivably at least trim 1 land. Now, the scales tip a little bit depending on the quality of the cantrips at your disposal, because cards like Brainstorm and Portent are infinitely better than cards like Opt and Discovery Dispersal. They just are. But there's some degree of truth to the idea of playing cantrips in order to lower your overall land count, so that early in the game you can use them to find lands, and late in the game you can use them to avoid drawing too many lands. The second tenet is a low threat density, but your cantrips help you find them. Like, the thing about cantrips is they are, at least theoretically, extra copies of whatever it is you're looking for. You know, in Standard 2011 and Callblade Standard, one of the most telling articles I've read was a Mike Flores piece about how to use Preordain correctly, which is not to jam it onto the battlefield on turn 1 just to use your mana. You used that card when you were looking for something. You know, if you mulligan aggressively to find Stoneforge Mystic and you keep a 1-lander Stoneforge Mystic hand, well, maybe you're preordaining on turn 1 to find your second land to cast Stoneforge Mystic, and that makes sense. Or maybe you've got the 1 land, you've got the lands you need, you've got the rest of the top of your curve ready, but you need to find the Stoneforge Mystic to fill in the gaps. Preordain makes sense there. You're trying to find something. But if there's not something you're actively seeking, there's no reason to run this card out, is the general premise behind playing your cantrips correctly. Early in the game, they represent additional lands, additional cheap interaction. Late in the game, they represent a way to win the game or a way to shut your opponent out of coming back. And that's the beauty of cantrips. I've done an episode on them before when it comes to evaluating them and whatnot, but how you use them is just as important as how powerful they are. Even in Standard, I see far too many players keep a 7-card hand and just jam an opt on turn 1 so they use their mana. Why? Save it until you know what you're looking for, especially if you're on the play. That's just not a play I like making. And then the third tenet for Turbo Xerox is low curve plus cantrips equals a low land count, but you're high on action. So the cantrips function as additional lands early and function as whatever you need them to be later. What that means is when other decks start to flood out, you aren't as susceptible to this problem. You may flood out on card draw. I've had that happen more than once. On 4 or 5 mana, and I'm trying to find something to wrestle control of the game away, and my cantrip will draw another cantrip, and now I can't cast anything else. But even that is a little bit more viable, a little bit more like long game friendly than sitting there and not using your mana. So the combination of a low mana curve and a low land count allows you to double spell earlier in the game. It allows you to really leverage my favorite abstract concept in Magic, which is tempo. Tempo being the idea that you can win games by resolving more spells than your opponent. And in some situations you treat, if your opponent's deck cares specifically about the combat phase, bouncing a creature is almost like them losing their turn. Countering their Nissa is time walking them. So being able to do that while progressing your own board, because you have a relatively low land count, but you hit your land drops, and then later in the game you're more frequently flush with spells in your hand, it's a big deal. And then we have the deck that inspired a teenage boy from rural West Tennessee. And that deck was Miracle Grow. That was circa 2000, probably circa 2001, I believe, is when Invasion released. That sounds right. And Invasion gave us an all-star creature in Quirion Dryad that's on its way back in Core 21, which is a big part of my inspiration for wanting to work on this deck in the first place. Quirion Dryad is 1 and a green, buys you a 1/1 creature, and she says whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or green, or white, blue, black, or red, rather, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So she can grow real thick, real quick. Alright? And Comer, realizing this, pushed this deck as far down that road as he could. Now, one of the key tenets for Comer's deck, the cantrip power level of Miracle Grow was unreasonably good. Comer had access to Brainstorm and Gush. Gush, that card that's banned in Vintage and Pauper. And Legacy. That card that reads 0 mana, draw 2 cards. Like, that's really, really good. Brainstorm in conjunction with Gush. If you started to somehow magically, we'll get to it in a minute, Gush, Brainstorm, I can't remember if there was another one involved here or not. Those were the two big ones, the ones I made notes about. When you have access to this many cards that really, really help push you ahead and cost 1 mana or less, you're doing something. You're doing stuff. In addition, the deck was powered heavily by free spells. We already talked about Gush. But in addition to Gush, we had access to Force of Will, Daze, and Land Grant, and Foil. And Land Grant was one of the key contributors to this deck, because a hand with multiple Land Grants was a hand with multiple lands in it. Because on turn 1, Land Grant's alternate casting cost is reveal your hand that has no lands in it. Cast Land Grant for free. Well, you would Land Grant, go get Tropical Island. Play Tropical Island. Oh wait, I don't have any lands in my hand. Play another Land Grant. Go get another Tropical Island. Leave up Days. Pass turn. Okay, you don't do anything I care about. End step will Brainstorm. Put these two on top. Draw. Land. Quirion Dryad. Gush. Draw 2. Put a counter on her. Pass turn. Oh, Force of Will, your removal spell. Put a counter on her. Draw. Land. Cast Brainstorm. Draw 3. Put 2 lands on top. Oh, look, my hand doesn't have any lands in it. Cast Land Grant. Like, you just keep going so far down this rabbit hole, to the point that Comer's deck played a grand total of 10 lands. 10. 1-0. So with the combination of cantrips to help smooth, and these free spells, one in particular, Land Grant, that really pushed it to the maximum. And then the last thing was emphasis on where Turbo Xerox was more like a traditional like aggro control deck, where you're trying to kind of occupy that middle space and catch up against aggro in order to land a threat and win, or against other control decks you would want to land a threat and then protect it. Miracle Grow was very much in the second camp. It wanted to start really fast and then jam, Force of Will, Daze, Counterspell, Foil, all did a really good job of protecting what should be a fragile setup. You've got either Quirion Dryad or Gaia Skyfolk wearing Curiosity. Those were your threats in Miracle Grow. That's not a lot. But it was enough. And the deck took off like wildfire, pardon the pun, because wildfire would be really good against this deck if it resolved. But the next step was to apply mid-range theory to it in the hands of master deck builders Ben Rubin and Brian Kibler when they innovated what they called Super Grow with the release of Odyssey for the same extended format. And that was to add some more lands back to the deck in order to add more standalone powerful cards. Instead of getting cute with stuff like Curiosity and Gaia Skyfolk and, cards like Foil, and instead of buying all the way in on it, they bought like 3/4 of the way and then just played some really big dumb stuff to help balance it out. Werebear and Mystic Enforcer were the two really big ones that they were playing. Both of them being threshold creatures that get bigger. Werebear was a 1/1 that gets +3/+3 when you have threshold or 7 or more cards in your graveyard, while Mystic Enforcer was I believe a 3/3 with protection from black that got +2/+2 when you had threshold. So both of those creatures, just as I make this reference a lot, those creatures allowed you to kind of punch above your weight class and interact favorably in combat with bigger creatures, kind of at a moment's notice, thanks to all the cheap or free instants in the deck. You could swing in with a Werebear into a bigger creature, and if your opponent blocks, maybe this mental note flips over and then you cast a daze for their attempted removal spell, and all of a sudden it's big. All of a sudden it has the right to bear arms. To hang a pair of bear arms on the wall. Anyway, the slightly less radical 14 lands due to the splash, because when you start adding a third color, the number of lands has to go up just to make sure you can play everything. Mystic Enforcer was a big deal, but there was another card that he splashed for, and that was the last tenant for Super Grow, which is the introduction of actual hard removal spells instead of counter magic and bounce. Counter magic and bounce could frequently be enough. I will grant that freely, land grant. I will land grant that freely. But sometimes something slips through. Sometimes you don't have the counter. And in the case of this deck, like, Swords to Plowshares was great in this deck, because it still pumped your Quarian Dryad, it still put your card in the graveyard for threshold, and it was another 1 mana spell that you could dig to with all these cantrips that you were playing. Was it blue for Force of Will? No. Is that okay? Absolutely. So the idea that you take the premise of using cantrips as mana fixing, a low land count and mana curve, and then you marry that to some classic mid-range theory of, if I've got bigger creatures than you, it's like I'm playing removal spells, and then if I also just play some removal spells, I neutralize the advantage of your creatures while still retaining all the advantages I have of playing this low land count with all these spells that'll help me dig to find my powerful stuff. And that's where we arrive on today. Quarian Dryad is in Core Set 2021. Is this deck something that's going to get built and be an utterly dominant force in Standard? I doubt it. But what it offers is, if you've got your lands, if you've done the work on Arena to grind out and craft all your shock lands, or at least the shock lands in Teamer colors, if you've done the work to grind out and trade aggressively into your shock lands and enemy fast lands and paper. It gives you a place to start on building forward. So using those lessons, let's talk about how I'm looking to build Temur Gro in Core 21 Standard. And it begins with the fact that we have Quirion Dryad, but unlike Kibler, Reuben, and Comer, we also have another creature at 2 mana that grows out of hand really fast, and it's one that I've been playing with a fair amount in Sprite Dragon. And notably, they're the same rarity for what it's worth. Sprite Dragon being a red and a blue buys you a 1/1 flying haste. Every time you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's a little bit less restrictive, don't you think? So that gives us 2 of those like powerhouse jam this on the table on turn 2, and if you untap with it, you can start to snowball an advantage. That's the first thing to look at here. The second, cantrips aren't great, but we have some. We have Opt. Currently, we have Discovery and Dispersal. We have Anticipate. We have Shimmer Possibility. And oh yeah, we're getting one in Core 21 that I'm really excited about in See the Truth. It's look at your top 3, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom. If this spell was cast from somewhere other than your hand, put all 3 of those cards into your hand instead. Now, that's the point that I'm going to have to work on the most, is like trying to figure out ways to use that. And it may end up being more correct to play Shimmer Possibility over See the Truth, simply because I don't want my opponents to get leverage on me with cards like Robber of the Rich. Like, if they Robber of the Rich and hit my See the Truth, they feel like they just won the lottery. But another cantrip that's available if we want it, it requires us to not play as much permission, is Light Up the Stage. Where you chip in and then you light up the stage. You put a counter on your creature. You see 2 cards. A counter spell revealed to light up the stage feels like a dead draw, but it frequently forces your opponent to play off curve or play something you don't care about instead of making the optimal play. And in that vein, it sometimes feels like it did its job. The key balance here is if we're going to play Light Up the Stage in this deck, we've got to play more proactive cards and less reactive cards. But on balance, we have access to some powerful cantrips in Standard. You know, Light Up the Stage plus See the Truth is actually just bananas. Because, by the way, if you hit See the Truth off Light Up the Stage and then you cast it during your next turn, you're drawing 3 cards for 2 mana. And it works under Narset Parter Veils because you add the cards to your hand, you don't draw them. That's really good. You know, if we end up going down Light Up the Stage route, maybe we have to play a couple of 1-drops. I don't know for sure. The build I'm working on currently is more akin to the Jeskai Heroic decks. A little bit less all in on Protect the Queen. You know, we're not playing a bunch of God's Willings and Karametra's Blessings. But the basic premise of stick an early threat, protect your lead, let it get bigger and beat them to death is the core tenet for the deck. A notable difference between this deck and, for example, Super Gro is our splash in this deck is actually 4 Quirion Dryad. This version of the deck is very much base, is it? Yes, it is. It's base blue-red. And being base blue-red means we get a lot of like casting non-creature spells matters cards. That's good. That's really good for a deck like this. I can't wait to play with it or play around with it in Historic, with access to Young Pyromancer. But the real gem, the real cherry on top, so to speak, is the last advantage that this deck has over grow-oriented strategy of the past. We have adventure creatures. Notably, we have two of the most powerful ones, the ones that get played the most. Bonecrusher Giant and Brazen Borrower. And Brazen Borrower is outside of a lot of people's price ranges, and I get that. It does have the benefit of being in a challenger deck, if that's something you want to look for. That's helped bring its price down some. But it's an unfortunate fact that that card is expensive. And, I mean, we can make do with something like Lovestruck Beast. It covers a lot of the same ground because it will pump one of your grow creatures in Sprite Dragon, and then it will be another creature with which to apply a lot of pressure. A Lovestruck Beast on the battlefield in conjunction with a poorly timed top deck of one of our grow creatures. If our opponent doesn't have a way to just kill the Lovestruck Beast, and their plan is to just remove the 1/1 so it doesn't attack, well, all of our grow creatures and all the rest of our Lovestruck Beasts allow it to just be a 3-mana 5/5. So even a suboptimal one, like the adventure creatures, cover a lot of ground here. They patch a lot of the holes, as it were. Brazen Borrower adds tempo removal and another body. The front half powers up both creatures. The back half still grows Quirion Dryad. Bonecrusher Giant, very much the same way. The front half is one of your much needed removal spells, ways to catch up against aggro. Damage can't be prevented is randomly relevant from time to time. Your opponent, you attack, your opponent casts God's Willing after blocking. You cast Stomp at their head. Well, now the protection doesn't work. So, I mean, Bonecrusher Giant, Brazen Borrower, Lovestruck Beast are all reasonable options within this shell. And I know it sounds like I'm just building a worse Team or Clover deck, and I probably am. If we're being real honest about it, I probably am. But I've always loved playing Grow. And given that I am not looking to try and make a run at the Players Tour in the immediate future, I feel like my time can be best devoted to trying to find things in the format that are not being explored well. And one of the advantages to this deck is you get a lot of the similar advantages that the Jeskai Heroic deck with Lurrus's Companion had before the Companion change. Namely, 2-drops that grow, the ability to protect your setup with efficient spells, and the ability to occupy sort of a tempo-based mid-game where you get to double spell a lot, you see a lot of cards thanks to cantrips. The core is there. If I rattled off the initial list verbatim, it's 4 Quirion Dryad, 4 Sprite Dragon, 4 Borrower, 4 Bonecrusher, 4 Opt, 4 See the Truth. Probably should be Shimmer Possibility. But then it's 3 Mystical Dispute, or I've got slashes on it. That's like Mystical Dispute or Quench or Aether Gust. And then 2 Negate, 2 Essence Scatter / Essence Capture, depending on how greedy you want your mana to be. And then we have more removal spells, because I can't help but feel like with all the Temur Reclamation that's getting played, we're going to start seeing a lot of aggro popping up. So we're playing all 4 Shocks, because Shock is like reasonable with all our grow cards. And it's another, it gives us another way to close the game out between Bonecrusher, Stomp, and Shock. We can beat them up a little bit in the early game and then just peel burn spells to close it out. It's embarrassing. It's not great, but it's another lane. It's another angle. But then one of the most exciting ones we're playing is Domri's Ambush. Because in conjunction with Sprite Dragon or Aquarian Dryad, Domry's Ambush is actually really good. Because we don't put one counter on them, we put two. And the other one gets one. Like, if you've got both, one of them gets two counters, the other one gets one, you kill something, and then you attack. That's a big game. When you simultaneously apply a lot more pressure, because 3 extra power is a lot more pressure, that could be the difference between a 2-turn clock and a 3-turn clock. So when you get to, in tandem with your removal spell, functionally shave a turn off your combat clock, that's a big deal. And then I think for the rest of them, it was 4 Shock, 2 Domry's Ambush, and 3 Scorching Dragonfire. Dragonfire being a clean out to cards like Uro. It's card advantage negative. I will grant that. If we had something like Magma Spray, I would rather play that. It would serve the same role. Notably, the irony here is even if they have... Well, no, I guess it doesn't work. Anyway. Even if your card deals no damage, Uro dies, Uro gets exiled. So if for whatever reason your Scorching Dragonfire doesn't deal any damage, you still exile Uro when it dies. So you get it on the way in. It's a clean answer to a lot of things in the standard format right now. Cleans up most of the creatures you want to kill. Cleans up a lot of the planeswalkers after activations. And just really sort of surges you ahead on the board. Especially if you've got one of those grow creatures down. And then, last but not least, is the mana base. We're playing 20 lands. 20 because we're only playing 8 cantrips, and as I mentioned before, they're not as good. I could see going down as low as 18 if you wanted to maybe add something like Light Up the Stage to the deck. In turn, trimming some permission to add some additional cantrips. You know, trim maybe the Essence Scatters and like trim the Essence Scatters and one of the Aether Gusts or Mystical Disputes. Trim that to play play 2 Light Up the Stages and like a Crash Through or something like that, just to keep seeing cards. Crash Through's relevant on all ends. Like, I really, really like the way this archetype is structured. We still have Shocklands in Standard, which is like the only reason this deck is remotely viable, but it also ports well into other formats. The historic version is going to be really interesting because it's going to be really close to what we have available in Pioneer. Because we'll have Young Pyromancer, Spell Pierce, Dive Down. I had it and I lost it. Maybe something like Grapple with the Past is something you want. I don't know. You know, but the idea behind playing cheap creatures that get bigger in conjunction with cantrips and cheap removal spells and permission that allow you to interact with the board and then dig for ways to close the game out once you start to pull ahead. That's at the core of this archetype. That's the core of this deck. It's one of the decks I've been trying to build right for the longest. And the more I researched it, the more interested I became in trying to do it again. Because it's been a labor of love that has never rewarded me very well. So we're going to see if it does any better this time. With that in mind, that's all I've got for this week. So, where can you find me? You can find me on Twitter. I'm at HomewardPathMTG. You can find me on Facebook. I'm Adam Spain. You can find me in the Facebook group we set up for the show called the Homeward Pathfinders. You can find me, if you're a patron of the show, or you want to become a patron of the show, you can find me at patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. Becoming a patron of the show gives you access to the Patreon Pathfinders Discord, where we talk about episode topics. We go through, there's some tier rewards you gain access to that get your stuff into episodes. And while you're at it, while you're perusing the web, don't forget to stop by our sponsor, puremtgo.com. They've got a massive collection of fantastic Magic-related articles and podcasts and videos and stuff out every single day. And do me a solid. He's not a sponsor, but my LGS is finally reopening this weekend. goosesgames.tcgplayerpro.com. Goose has been around for a long time. He's been around long enough to see me quit playing Magic for 5 years and then come back. That's how long he's been around. And he was around maybe in an unofficial capacity, but he was around before that, well before that. So he's reopening. He does online sales. I do not have a promo code currently. It's something I will have to talk to him about. But I'm excited. My LGS is reopening. Another thing I'm contemplating doing, I really need more like back and forth with people about, is doing arena F&Ms with the listeners of this show. If you are interested in that, let me know. I want to do it, but I need to know there's enough people before I start putting in a whole heck of a lot of effort for it. Because, it's hours off my life and hours I don't get to spend, heavily interacting with the kids. So, all that out of the way, it's time to go into my favorite thing, the end of every episode. It's time for, let's get them pulled up, hashtag MTG Dad Jokes. And we got a few. Is that new? That feels like it's new. Yep, we got new ones. All right. First is from Dev at Strictly Better MTG. Another one of my favorites because Dev, like me, is a purveyor of budget Magic. And Dev was very simple with this. The picture is Kite Sail Freebooter and it says Freeboot Reboot. I said, it's not quite a joke per se, but I'm not one to argue semantics. We have Drock V Pauper. Wife, the puppy keeps stealing Guinness's food. He's such a bully. Me, maybe we should change his name to Boros. Wife says, what? If you don't play a lot of Pauper, you don't know why that joke's funny. Oh, come on, pull it up. Next one we have is from Emma Partlow, columnist at tcgplayer.com. Also purveyor of budget Magic content. Says, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty inscredible before sharing the link to her article, Modern on a Budget, Scred Red. That joke tells itself. It's really good. We had Brian Sharp, longtime supporter of the show, shared the image of the Jumpstart planes that actually has a dog pictured and featured prominently in the art on the front. And it says, it's a fetch land. And last but not least, certainly not least, we have a thread from Brian DeMars. And this thing is a doozy. What is your all-time favorite Magic the Gathering win condition? He says, I'm a fan of the mid-90s slow jam. I like the way you worker it. Antiquities. I got to power it up. It's Mishra's Factory. Brian. And then we have Drock V Pauper. Says, all-time favorite win condition? Mill. Maybe that explains why I'm O-Life. We have Morphling, and it says, And Morphling says, now that's what I call magic, late 90s alt pop. If power creep goes crazy, then will you still call me Superman? Rule 1043A, a player can concede the game at any time. Brian says, I respect that. Mindslaver's my second choice. Oh, man. So many good ones. So many good ones. That's all I got for today. That's all I got for this week, everybody. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope, like me, you've got a pet project you've been looking into. If you do, dig into it really deep. Go into the history. Find out as much about the archetype as you possibly can. Because for me, it felt like it gave me a new perspective on how to build those decks. And no, that doesn't mean I'm going to build a new perspectives deck. I've got to draw the line somewhere. But with that in mind, we're going to sign off by reminding you, everybody's going through stuff right now. There's a lot of stuff going on in this country, in this world. So just remember, when you're interacting with people, never be cruel, never be cowardly. Remember that hate is always foolish, love is always wise. Always try to be nice, but never fail to be kind. So go forth, build decks, be kind. We'll catch you next week. Thanks, everybody.